First of all, when we look at personal income tax reductions, over this last decade, we've seen a significant reduction in personal income taxes across all income categories. So you can basically, anybody in this province at any one income level has seen at least a 37% reduction in their personal income taxes. And in fact, for the lower income groups, low and modest income British Columbians, the reduction has been much more than that. We now have the lowest personal income taxes in Canada for individuals earning up to $119,000 a year, and we are second only to Alberta for incomes above that. In terms of the corporate income tax rates, again, we've seen that general rate come down to 10% effective January of this year, and we are seeing the small business tax rate being eliminated as of April of 2012. So when you start looking at BC as a place to invest, it actually has changed pretty dramatically over this last decade. When you consider that in the 1990s, the average growth in investment increased by about 1% annually, and in this last decade, we've seen that going up at a rate of about 4.4% a year. Things like bankruptcies is often looked at as a measure of the health of the economy. And again, if you look back to the 1990s, you can see where bankruptcies were relatively speaking fairly consistent year after year, but in this last decade we've seen the rate of bankruptcies drop dramatically in British Columbia. And what's even more interesting is that we did not see any uptick in bankruptcies as we went through the worst global economic recession that we have seen in several decades, in many decades. And at the same time, corporations have gone up during that period of time as well. There's a lot of people talk about standard of living, and I think one of the measures of a standard of living is the real personal disposable income. And again, in the 1990s, we actually saw that real disposable personal disposable income go down by about 0.8%, an annual reduction rate of about 0.8%. And in this last decade, we have seen that increasing at an annual rate on average of 2.1%. I know this next slide is a bit complicated at first glance, but really what it shows is during the 1990s, British Columbia in most years was lagging behind Canada as a whole when it came to real GDP growth. And in this last decade, again, we have seen most of those years, with one exception, British Columbia has exceeded the growth rate for the rest of Canada. Healthcare is one thing, and I know one of the things that you'll see in this budget is something that I've talked about in speeches I've given around the province, but I think this is the first time we've really spelled it out in a budget document and in a budget speech, and that is this fact, that British Columbia today has the second lowest per capita spending on healthcare of any province in Canada. Now, I know there are people in this room that will say that that's a terrible thing, but you hear so much concern by British Columbians and by Canadians about the sustainability of healthcare funding and how in every year we see the healthcare budgets consume more and more and more of the provincial revenues in every province and every part of Canada. But in British Columbia, I'm proud of the fact that we are the province that's actually leading in building sustainability for healthcare in this particular province. So I think what's important, and I mentioned this in the budget speech, is that you cannot measure the success of a healthcare system based on how many taxpayers' dollars you spend. You have to measure the success of a healthcare system based on outcomes. And when you start looking at the outcomes that we see in British Columbia, where we have the highest average life expectancy of any part of Canada, we have the best cancer outcomes in Canada, the best heart disease outcomes in terms of low mortality rates, and we have the second lowest infant mortality rates in Canada. Those are significant health outcomes, and it actually points to the success that we've had of ensuring that we can actually drive better value for the dollars that we're spending in healthcare. When you start looking in the education system, we see the per capita, the per student funding for the K-12 education system going up to a new all-time high of $8,357 per student. We have also fully funded the implementation of full-day kindergarten. Half of the students had the option of going into all-day kindergarten this last September, and of course the coming September we will have that option available to BC families for 100% of students eligible for kindergarten in British Columbia. Post-secondary institutions, we're seeing a leveling off of funding for post-secondary, but again, considerably higher than it was in the 2001-2002 fiscal year, representing a 36% increase over that period of time. There's been lots of talk about stimulus spending on infrastructure, the need to make sure that we can maintain jobs in the construction sector as we came through the global economic recession. And as you can see, there is the bump up in those 3 years, reflecting the extra stimulus spending that we would put in place in partnership with the federal government and municipalities. And while we do see the annual amount of spending coming down, we are still in the future seeing infrastructure build in British Columbia that is high compared to the historical trends that we had seen over the past number of decades. So as I mentioned at the outset, this is a status quo budget. There is targeting spending increases to protect key services. Most of the increases that you see in the budget in that third year of the fiscal plan, in terms of health care and also in terms of social development, are increases that were triggered by decisions made by government prior to this transition period. Other changes that would be reflected in that third year of the fiscal plan, decisions that had not been made at that point by government, are decisions that will have to be made by the Executive Council after the new Premier is in place. And also it provides the flexibility that I mentioned for Executive Council in the future, and it still maintains the deficit reduction strategy that we put in place in September of 2009 to get us back to balanced budget by the 2013-14 fiscal year. So we are seeing spending continue to rise over this period, but at a slightly reduced rate, a rate of increase of about 2%. And on the revenue, we are forecasting an average of 3.4% growth, and that allows us to get back to the balanced budget by 13-14. And again, this next chart shows that the deficit track. The deficit for this fiscal year that we are currently in is significantly lower than what we had forecast at the time of last year's budget. So it comes down to now a forecast $1,265 million, and that still includes $150 million of forecast allowance, which has not yet been allocated. And again, the debt-to-GDP ratio, as you know, is one thing that is very important to an important indicator of the financial health of a jurisdiction. And at the time of the last year's budget, we were forecasting that while we had brought that debt-to-GDP ratio down to a low of 13.4%, with the recession and the deficits and the increased infrastructure spending, we are seeing that debt-to-GDP ratio go up. As of the budget last year, we were forecasting it would peak out at 17.9%. We are in fact now forecasting that that will be down slightly, that it should peak out at about 17.8% and then get back to a trend of declining debt-to-GDP ratios. And I think the other thing, when you start looking at our debt-to-GDP ratio compared to other provinces, we have the third lowest in Canada, and by all measures, that level of debt load is affordable for the size of the economy and the rate of growth of the economy that we are anticipating in the coming years. Prudence is still a very important part of our budget. There's times we've been criticized for being too conservative in our assumptions that we use for building budgets. We are not apologizing for that. We are no less conservative in our approach to this budget than we have always been. And we are putting in place, as I mentioned, a $600 million contingency for this coming year and $450 million for each of the years after. And we are maintaining a $350 million forecast allowance over the course of the fiscal plan. We are starting to see many of the economic indicators coming back, albeit the North American economy and the European economies are recovering at a slower pace than would have been anticipated even a year ago. But we are seeing positive and steady economic improvements in our economy. Exports have been growing. We've had considerable success with our exports into the Asia-Pacific region. And we are starting to see positive signs for growth in terms of our exports into the U.S. market, although they are coming back slower than I think most economists would have anticipated as we came through the recession. The one thing I think that's very important to the BC economy is the diversification of our trade. So we now see our exports into the U.S. constitute less than half of our overall exports. So our dependence on the U.S. market is significantly less today than any other province in Canada. So at the same time, we're seeing this significant growth in the Asia-Pacific region. Over the course of this 4 years that is set out on these charts, an average of about over a third of our exports going into Asia. And in fact, when you look at the numbers just from last year, that is even higher, closer to about 40%. And there's every expectation that that is going to grow in the years ahead. Housing starts are not at the levels that they were during the middle part of this past decade, but we are seeing housing starts recovering after getting down to a low in 2009, an annual rate of 11,000. We're now back up in the 30,000 range, which is closer to our historical levels that we've seen in British Columbia. In terms of employment, we are just about back to the all-time record high level of jobs that we had in British Columbia. And even though there's been a couple of months where we've seen the unemployment rate in this province rise, the unemployment rate that we see in British Columbia at the time of the last labor force survey being released earlier this month, that rate is still lower than the lowest annual unemployment rate that we saw during the 1990s. Consumer spending is also back above pre-recession levels. And I think that is a very positive indicator and higher than what we had anticipated even just a year ago. Risks to the recovery is one of the slides that I always set out at this time. And many of the risks are still the same as they have been in past years. We could see a continued weakening of the U.S. economy, even though that is not what most of the economists are forecasting. We could see slower global demand for BC products. Things have been looking good. We expect the demand to continue, but there is always that risk that is out there. And European debt crisis is one that we're tracking closely, obviously, as I think all countries around the world are. There is the Canadian housing markets are looked to be pretty solid right now, but again, there's always that possibility. And the other risk is a sudden depreciation of the Canadian dollar. And some people have commented over these last number of months about how businesses are taking a sudden impact because of the appreciation of the Canadian dollar in these last number of months. When in reality, I think any business that had a business plan over these last 4 or 5 years that did not factor in the possibility of a Canadian dollar above par probably didn't have a good business plan. Because if anything, the rise to par happened slower than I think many people were anticipating. But certainly a sudden appreciation of the Canadian dollar would be something that would obviously be one of the risks that are there. But I think on balance, I think what we are seeing is steady economic recovery in British Columbia. We are seeing steady job growth overall, if you start looking at anything but the month-to-month ups and downs. And I think we are starting to see steady recovery in provincial revenues for the years ahead. So I thank you again for being here, and I will come back in an hour or so and field whatever questions the members of the media have for me at that time. Thank you very much.